It was with awe that I beheld fresh leaves, green leaves, bright in the sun. Silent a while in a cave, I watched a waterfall for the first of the summer observances. Friends, welcome back to the Reiki Women podcast. My name is Michaela Daystar of Heartscapes Reiki and Bronwyn Logan of International House of Reiki and Carrie Varela of the Reiki Healing Society. And I are here to talk today about a topic that just really stirs the heart. And that is the topic of the relationship between Reiki and poetry. And so we just opened with two poems from the Japanese poet Basho. And we're going to explore today in our conversation the role that poetry has played in Japan, in Japanese history, and specifically in the practice of the system of Reiki. How contemplation of poetic word, poetic verse can really stir things inside of us that support our Reiki practice and our experience as people. So we're really excited to have this conversation following on last week's conversation about beauty and creativity and the relationship between those experiences and our Reiki practices. So we're happy to have this conversation, and we'd love to get started, Bronwyn, with you sharing a little bit of context about poetry in Japan and how we can relate to this topic in regard to our Reiki practice.
Yeah. Thanks, Michaela. Well, I know a little bit, not heaps, but hey, I will share what I do know. And I interviewed Thomas Macaulay from Sheffield University a while ago. I'll put the link with this podcast. And he translates Wakka. So Wakka is Japanese poetry or Japanese song. And he's been doing it for more than 20 years. Each week he sends an email out with these beautiful poems translated. So he was the perfect person to ask about what Wakka is. And there's a little translation that he has from the 9th century, which explains a little bit about the poetry. And I thought I'd read that out for you. It says, poetry has its seed in the human heart and blossoms forth in innumerable leaves of words. It is poetry which, with only a part of its power, moves heaven and earth, pacifies unseen gods and demons, reconciles men and women, and calms the heart of savage warriors. I thought that's so beautiful. And it's in the preface to a 9th century Japanese piece, which this is actually the first description of Wakka, of Japanese poetry. And Japanese poetry was created to give the Japanese their own form of poetry in contrast to the Chinese poetry, which had been very popular in Japan. So there's lots of different sorts of Wakka, and there's long form, short form. The Wakka that we know within the system of Reiki, which is the Wakka that the Meiji Emperor, so the emperor who was the emperor in Japan in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that particular poetry that he wrote, a lot of it was used within the system of Reiki. So what we were actually just talking about before is that I wanted to look and see, were there any women involved with this? Yes. And because it does seem to be quite a male domain in Japan. And the good news is that the Empress, so the Meiji Emperor's wife, Empress Shokan, also wrote many, many, many Wakka. And they're called tanka, the ones that the Emperor and the Empress wrote, tanka. So they had a certain number of syllables, in the same way that many of us know haiku today, and haiku also has a certain number of syllables and is also a form of Wakka, Japanese poetry. When I first heard about the poetry in Reiki, I was really curious, and I read a book called Three Budo Masters by John Stevens, and he talks about it's the founders of Judo, Aikido, and Karate, and uh, he talked about how they used to go out at night when there was a full moon, and they would recite poetry to the moon. And I thought, wow, that is so beautiful. And it's just such a something that we wouldn't think is a very, I don't know how to say that, manly thing to do, if you get what I'm saying, right? So it just seemed, when I don't mean to genderize any of this, but, it has, I think, poetry in this day and age is often not considered something that, someone who's very physically minded would be necessarily doing. Yeah, I thought that was very beautiful. And then I could see that link in, because those founders were also the peers of Mikao Usui, the founder of the system of Reiki. So that's really beautiful that we could see why then Mikao Usui was also using poetry, and how that was something which was very respected. And yeah, it's quite beautiful looking at the different sorts of poems that which we will look at a little later today, the different poems that the founder of the system did incorporate into the system of Reiki, and why. So I don't know, do any of you guys have you got any thoughts on why there might be poetry within the system of Reiki?
Yeah, well, I was actually just going to ask you that question. And, I use poetry. I use poetry all the time in my teaching before I knew about this connection to Wakka. And so, it's been a natural evolution of incorporating poetry in deeper and deeper ways. And so, I think when I think about the ways that I naturally gravitated to poetry in my teaching, and think about, okay, what might the purpose have been then originally? I'm curious where those overlaps might be. I've since, learned a little bit about that, but there's so much more depth that I don't know. But for me, incorporating poetry into my teaching and into my personal practice is a way to begin to evoke the sorts of feelings and sensations and insights that we often struggle to put words to. There's so many times in classes that I'll ask a question, or I'll invite somebody to share an experience that they've had with a practice, and they say, I just don't have the words. I can't find the right words to express what I just experienced. And observing that over time, that was very common. I've incorporated, inviting people to make gestures, or to use song, or to use images, to release our reliance on verbally describing things. And oftentimes poetry can be a way of opening up those spaces that are less linear, that are less like fixed to a specific meaning. I mean, English in particular is so good at describing things precisely, right? It's such a linear language. It's such a precise language. It's so good at talking about the details and making sure things are very accurate. And that's very useful. However, there's limitations in that. Japanese, for example, is a much more metaphoric language, a much more non-linear language, much less fixed definition on this word means exactly, precisely this definition. And so even using poetry written in English, we can start unlocking a little bit of that fluidity, a little bit of that access to those intangible things that are so difficult for us to describe in words. And then, of course, it brings in the presence of beauty. And as we talked about last week, beauty is something that we naturally gravitate towards. We naturally look for to help us define our experience. And it's naturally soothing and healing to us to be in the presence of something that we perceive as beautiful. And so it's, another way of layering in beauty.
Yeah, that symmetry as well, isn't it? That symmetry of so many syllables is that that gives a type of beauty as well, doesn't it? It's something we can sit into, and that structure makes you have to work harder to create.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So Carrie, I'd love to hear for you, like, what's your relationship with poetry, and if it's something that's come into your practice at all, and then maybe we can tease out some of these like original uses of poetry, which was a very specific tool that was used by Mikao Usui in developing the system of Reiki. So what comes up for you, Carrie?
Yeah, well, I think that this is just a fascinating topic. I'm kind of more of a fly on the wall in terms of, my usage of poetry or bringing poetry or my own poetry into my practice, particularly with Reiki. But I would say that yoga has allowed me to kind of weave in some of the beauty of words that you describe. And it's really taught me a lot about our attention span as humans, especially in a yoga class. If I read a poem to you, like there's only so much that actually goes in, I think. I mean, some people can be really present and like receptive of it. But like what I like about a Wakka poem and what I've used in the past that's been really effective is just like 1 or 2 lines of particularly the Yoga Sutras or another source, that felt meaningful in the moment. I'm trying to think of some, but that were just really short. And if you're familiar with the idea of a sutra, so the sutra is like a thread of a teaching or thread of a thought. And so to use those things as a tool to unite the mind, the body, the heart around a topic. And so if you can give somebody like this drop of knowledge that's like 2 lines, 3 lines, really simple and straightforward, but yeah, it can really flavor like the whole like meditative quality of the practice. And so those are kind of sometimes my uses. Sometimes I'll offer a poem in Shavasana while people have just, moved their body and they feel like really open. I think that also is a really beautiful offering. But yeah, and I'm really fascinated to learn a little bit more about Wakka poetry. And I recently took the Okuden training, and it was just so lovely, to incorporate the Wakka poem that's included in the manual that I was using. And Bronwyn, maybe you can talk more. I have it right here in front of me, but I don't want to turn away from our conversation.
Yeah, well, I love what you were saying about the thread. That's so beautiful, isn't it? Oh gosh, there's so many. I mean, that is actually the joy of us being able to speak words, is sometimes the words are just so succinct, so they really, they are perfect, and that just seems like such a perfect word for just pulling everything together, that thread. And I thought that was really beautiful. Just going back to that little bit that I read before from the 9th century, I thought it was also interesting. We were just talking about how things integrated. We were talking about non-duality, and so, here in that piece, it's actually talking about dual elements. So it's talking about gods and demons, men and women, heaven and earth. So these dual elements, and how poetry brings these things into play and together, so how we use poetry to blend. And that's really, when we talk about the system of Reiki, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to move from a non-dual space, and from a dual space. I always get those words mixed up. I'm so sorry. It's a bit like left and right. I never know what's left and right. I have to really think about it. So if you hear me saying dual and non-dual in the wrong way, you'll know why. But you get the meaning. And so that's my brain doing its own little weird thing. But it's just bringing together elements, and that's what we do with everything that we do within the system of Reiki, to try to blend everything so that we have this sense of living in a complete whole space. And yeah, I thought that's, we can really see how that might correlate through. So using the Wakka, using the poetry as a way of not just observing, because I think there is an element of observation about poetry. It's like, oh, that's what that means, but a way of embodying a thought or a feeling, an understanding. And so yeah, really getting something that someone is saying. And so within the system of Reiki, we have used in the past poetry, as you know, as we were all saying, so the poetry of the Meiji Emperor. And I think possibly I reckon probably the Empress's poetry was in there too. It may just not be acknowledged as the Empress's poetry. Could possibly be, right? Who knows? I mean, you don't often see, I think, necessarily that sort of work published, and it always seems to be the emperor that they talk about, and yet she also wrote so many Wakka herself, so who knows. But there is a student of Mikao Usui called Kaji Tomita, and Kaji Tomita wrote a book and about hands-on healing and meditation practice. So it's his take on the system of Reiki. Yeah. And he has a practice which is a variation of what we know as Hatsureiho. And so Hatsureiho is a blending of a couple of practices together, and within the system of Reiki, we call it Hatsureiho. He also calls it Hatsureiho. It's just slightly different. And we practice Joshin Kokyuho, and which is, focusing the mind with the breath technique of breathing down into the hara and then expanding that energy. He does it slightly differently. So his focus, instead of focusing completely on just the hara, he gives the mind something to focus on, and that is one of the emperor's poems.
That's making me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go.
I feel kind of tickled to hear that description of that modification of Joshin Kokyuho, because as I was sharing earlier, I led a 21-day practice focusing on poetry and Reiki, and Carrie provided a poem for one of those sessions, which was really beautiful. I'll put a link to those videos down below in our notes. But when I was trying to conceive of, how to do this, how to bring Reiki in, not having a direct source like that explained, specifically how poetry was used inside the system. I knew that it was, but not specifically. Essentially, that's kind of how I conceived it, was leading us into a Joshin Kokyuho practice. And then once we're, in that state of focusing our mind on the hara and envisioning that bright light, it was bringing the poem into that space and allowing the poem to expand along with that light at our center to fill us and surround us. Yeah. And so it was like drawing the poem in and then filling ourselves with it, surrounding ourselves with it, and allowing the imagery inside of the poem to kind of work on us. So I love hearing that more, more contemporaneous description of how poetry would have been used originally inside the system.
Yeah. Actually, Carrie, I'd love to hear the poem.
From Tamika?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have it here. Hold on.
Yeah, I loved doing that practice because, partnering with so many other folks, I got to be exposed to so many different poems that I'd never heard before. I have quite a few books of poetry, but it's such a vast genre, right? There's just so many. And the one that you brought, Carrie, was one of my favorites. So I love that you brought it.
Okay, so I'll share that one then. Let me see. Oh, oops. Hold on. Okay, so this comes from Maria Sabina. She is a Mexican healer and poet. Heal yourself with the light of the sun and the rays of the moon, with the sound of the river and the waterfall, with the swaying of the sea and the fluttering of birds. Heal yourself with mint, neem, and eucalyptus. Sweeten with lavender, rosemary, and chamomile. Hug yourself with the cocoa bean and a hint of cinnamon. Put love in tea instead of sugar and drink it looking at the stars. Heal yourself with the kisses that the wind gives you and the hugs of the rain. Stand strong with your bare feet on the ground and with everything that comes from it. Be smarter every day by listening to your intuition, looking at the world with your forehead. Jump, dance, sing so that you can live happier. Heal yourself with beautiful love. And always remember that you are the medicine. I don't know. There's something, it is so true about poetry that can really cut through, right? Like cut through the resistance sometimes. And I feel like I see that sometimes when trying to maybe describe Reiki to somebody else, or I even see it with yoga, is that sometimes we walk into healing spaces and we got our traumas on, we got our boundaries up, we've got our ego there. And so my challenge as a practitioner, I think of it, and also as a yoga teacher, is how do I disarm people's egos? And one of those ways, I mean, this is just such a beautiful, profound tool, right? Because it just kind of cuts through all of that garbage and brings us and evokes inside of us a really beautiful, emotional, spiritual message. And sometimes, we can like look at the same poem, and be in this kind of maybe closed down place, and none of it resonates. But if we can, be in the right place when we're receptive to it, it's like I think of the words that that poetry inspires in me. It has this beautiful resonance with the nature connection, but also the importance of healing ourselves. Like what I loved about that poem too, it doesn't speak to like anyone else healing you. It's really coming back into yourself and feeling healed and loved by the earth, which I think is a unique perspective. But what was I going to say about that?
Can I just say, it's something that I love about it, that it's really affected you and your teachings, because you use the words, such and such, that's our medicine, like you use that a lot. And I've always loved that. And I thought, where does that come from? Now I know where it comes from. Right? I think that's where it comes from. Am I right?
It's some part of it. Yeah. I mean, I think it's more, I think it's more common maybe in my generation, maybe a little bit more my generation below me, is more like music is medicine.
Oh, really? Okay.
Everything is medicine. And, but it's a profound way of looking at things, because I think we often look to something that might heal us and not be open to other avenues, let's say.
Yeah.
One of the things that
one of my trains of thought that I came back to is how in one word, or even in a series of words, a short sentence, is that it has this almost spiritual and emotional energy attached to it. So we could say something like medicine, or you are the medicine, or compassion. And within that, I think it speaks to our oneness. It's like, so compassion might be different to Michaela, it might be different to Bronwyn, might be different to any of you listening, but it has this kind of emotional, spiritual, energetic quality. And that it's in that place where we are really sharing the space and sharing the energy.
Yeah, it's like finding those places of interconnection, right? Where a word or an image will invoke something that feels the same, right? That feels connected. And it really stands out to me, that poem very specifically draws on images of nature and our relationship, like very explicitly names our relationship with nature as one of healing and love. And we see that in a different way in a lot of Wakka poetry, where many of them, certainly the majority of the ones that I've read, are describing nature, describing observable natural phenomenon, and describing the feelings that are evoked from being in relationship with nature. And that, so specifically, represents and draws on the foundation, the Shinto foundations of this practice, and reminds us that a huge part of the conceptualization, the methodology, the actual direct experience, and then also the metaphoric experience that we see in the system of Reiki is explicitly tied to our relationship to nature. That it's both metaphoric, but it's also direct experience. That really we're being invited to come out of the intellectual sphere, to come out of the space of spirituality as a practice of the intellect alone, and to step into direct experience with the natural world. And so we have these brief, I loved, Carrie, that you talked about the power of brevity, when things are short, how they can really work on us in a different way than when things are longer. We have these very brief, very direct, simple, clear descriptions of a moment in nature, like the two poems that I opened with, this moment of observing something in the natural world. And then you sit there and you contemplate that, and you notice what happens inside when you remember a moment that you might have had that's like that, a connection that you had with the color green, with the leaves, with the waterfall, noticing that the season was turning from one to the next. And it really, it draws on something universal inside of us. And, connected to the poem that you just shared, Carrie, it draws on our innate capacity to heal, and that is not just inside of us, and it's not just outside of us. It is that alchemy of the spaces between inside of us and the world around. And so I love that so much of that can get communicated in such a simple, short, beautiful moment that is evoked in a poem.
As a proud parent, I would like to read my child's poem. Which
I love that they wrote you a Wakka poem.
This is from many years ago, but it's exactly what you were talking about. The fact that if we're given structure and something, a snapshot of something, this is a snapshot of something, and that's why I love it. And I actually have this on my wall in the kitchen. I love it. And so my child, because I've always loved cooking, right? So that's what this is about. So it works with the kitchen theme. And it goes, my mum starts singing. She's talking about dinner. She says, delicious.
Oh,
I love it.
And, well, if you knew me cooking, I do like to sort of sing a little bit and a bit, so it's just sort of like everything blended together, and that thing of when you're tasting things and it's like, oh yeah, that it's going to be delicious. It's just got that whole feel for me of that warm space, and having that structure, because that's the haiku structure. So what is it? It's 575, isn't it? 575 syllables. And, it's really tight, but you can say so much in such a small space. And I think that's really special. The tanka of the Meiji Emperor were actually a little longer. And I've got here the actual syllables because it is a longer thing. So it's 5 syllables, 7, 5, and then 7, 7. So it's sort of broken up into 2 sections. So they are a little bit longer than the haiku, which are more popular today. And I know that when people start writing poetry in this way, they can really get into it, and they write and they write and they write, and which is fascinating, because you think it would be an incredible challenge to have to do that, but there's something in us that loves that symmetry, and it is the beauty of writing and expressing ourselves in a very structured way. It gives some sense of, I don't know, what is that? It's like it makes us feel orderly, you know, and you know how it releases anxiety. It brings patterns, isn't it? It's about patterns.
Exactly. Yeah, we talked about that last week, about the way in which a structure, like a pattern, like a set of instructions, like a syllabic form, like 57577, gives us that firmness, that container that then we can, spin out so much creativity and fluidity because we're being held. And so, as you said, you would think that it would be difficult to like stay inside such a rigid structure. However, once you feel that rhythm in your body, right? Once you get the pattern of 57577, it just happens, right? Like you just feel the rhythm of the words. And, our mind is so good at casting out and finding what we need. And, our language is so vast. There's always a word that's going to fit in, and then you get these wonderfully creative ways of expressing something, partly because of being bound by a structure, right? I need a word that's 3 syllables here. And so I'm going to bring something else in. And then, different metaphors can happen. I loved the last line of your child's poem that said, and she says delicious, something like that.
Yeah.
And, to me, it was like, you could take that literally. You said the word delicious, dinner's going to be delicious. But to me, I heard like the sounds and the smells of your cooking, like spoke delicious, right? So it's like, even in that simple thing, you get this blending, right? This non-duality of all of the senses working together to communicate something. It's not just the speech, it's not just the scent. It's like all of it comes together and says, oh, this feels like home. This feels like my mother. This feels like delicious,
Yeah, very beautiful.
Love it. And I can totally see you, Bronwyn, as like this fairy in the kitchen, like humming food and like
the person who
it.
cannot follow a recipe book has to create their own creation, right? Yeah.
Well, you're probably not as much of a baker then, if you don't want to follow recipes.
I could be a bad baker. I'm not very good at bread, put it that way.
Baking is much more precise and recipe dependent.
Oh, well, I think we should finish off with a little meditation that we were talking about earlier. Let's do some Joshin Ho according to Kaji Tomita, and there's one poem that we've often used with that, which is one of the Emperor's poems, and I'm going to do that all for you right now. So if you'd just like to get yourself nice and balanced, feeling calm and relaxed, get your feet to the ground, feel those shoulders relax. And just to begin with, let's just bring our hands up into the Gasso position, just to set our intention for the practice. We're going to practice Joshin Ho within the form of Hatsare Ho by Kaji Tomita. And when you're ready, bringing your hands down and placing them on your thighs. Taking some lovely breaths down into the belly. That deep belly below your belly button into the hara. Don't force it, just let it naturally flow down and fill you up, and then release. So this is a mind purification method. And we purify the mind by giving it something to focus upon, something beautiful. So focus on the breath. For the moment, as you feel that lovely grounding, connecting through to the earth. You feel your back lengthening, your neck open and wide. You feel your mind moving up into the sky. And that beautiful blending of the earth and the heavens occurs. And it beams from the heart center of the body as we feel in touch with ourselves, in our completeness, our wholeness, in our healing. And the poem is, as a great sky in clear light green, I wish my heart would be as vast. As a great sky in clear light green, I wish my heart would be as vast. Breathing in the energy of the poem, breathing out the energy of the poem. And coming back, just bringing your hands back up into Gusso to give thanks. And in Kaji Tomita's words, he says that this poem or reciting poetry in meditation helps to create what he calls Reha, which is this wave of Rei, this wave of spiritual energy in the body. And he says that if we do this practice for 5 consecutive days and concentrate for at least 30 minutes, and building that up to an hour throughout that time, that we will definitely experience that sensation of spiritual energy in the body. So there's a challenge. Until next time.
So who among you out there in the listening world would like to take on this challenge of doing this practice that Bronwyn, you just beautifully led us through, of taking at least a half an hour a day for a week, you said? 1 week?
5 days.
5 days, at least a half hour a day, building up to an hour for 5 days of resting your mind, focusing your mind on a poem, a simple, beautiful poem, perhaps the one that Bronwyn shared, perhaps another that speaks to you. Take on that challenge and let us know how it goes. Let us know what happens, what experiences come forward, and perhaps there won't be words that you can share that accurately describe that experience. Maybe you'll actually need to put it into a poem or into a dance or into a gesture or some other beautiful, creative way of communicating what you experience when you rest your mind on something beautiful. So we challenge you to do that. We want to hear how it goes. Perhaps I will take on this challenge and report back. And until next week, beautiful friends, have a wonderful, wonderful week. And grand adventure and wherever it leads you. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us on Reiki Women Podcast, and we will see you and hear you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.